February 1945, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Sergeant Thomas Kellerman stood in the mess hall doorway watching steam rise from industrial coffee urns that had been brewing since 0400 hours. The bitter aroma filled the cramped space where 200 German prisoners of war sat at long wooden tables, their gray uniforms marked with the letters PW painted in white across their backs. Most picked at their breakfast trays with visible disgust, but it was the coffee that drew their most vocal contempt. Oberfreiter Hans Müller, a former Panzer crewman captured in the Ardennes, held his tin cup at arm's length as though it contained poison. His loud commentary in German carried across the hall, and though Kellerman's German was rudimentary at best, the mocking laughter from surrounding tables told him everything he needed to know. The prisoners had found yet another aspect of American military life to ridicule, and this morning, it was the coffee. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Kellerman had been managing prisoner details at Camp Concordia for 8 months, ever since a training accident left him with a reconstructed knee that ended his hope of overseas deployment. The irony of guarding Germans in Kansas while his younger brother fought across France was not lost on him, nor was the resentment he felt watching these prisoners enjoy 3 meals daily while European civilians starved. The coffee situation had become a daily ritual of humiliation. Every morning the Germans would make elaborate shows of sipping the army brew, grimacing theatrically, and launching into lengthy German complaints that needed no translation. Kellerman understood their game perfectly. They were testing boundaries, asserting dominance in the only way available to men stripped of weapons and freedom. The coffee mockery was psychological warfare waged with tin cups and exaggerated disgust. The United States Army's coffee in 1945 was legendarily bad, a fact acknowledged even by American soldiers who drank it by the gallon. The official specification called for a blend of Robusta beans, chosen for their caffeine content and shelf stability rather than flavor. The brewing process involved boiling massive quantities in urns that were rarely cleaned properly, producing a beverage that tasted vaguely of metal, burnt rubber, and institutional despair. Soldiers joked that army coffee could strip paint, dissolve spoons, or be used as an alternative to diesel fuel in emergencies. The humor masked genuine dissatisfaction, but for American GIs, complaining about coffee was as traditional as complaining about officers, mail delays, or virtually anything else in military life. For the German prisoners, however, the terrible coffee represented something more significant than simple beverage disappointment. It confirmed their carefully maintained belief in American inferiority. These men, despite being captured and transported thousands of miles from home to camps in the American heartland, clung fiercely to notions of German cultural and material superiority. They had lost battles certainly, but they had not lost their conviction that German discipline, and German civilization remained superior to the crude, materialistic American culture that now held them prisoner. The coffee became a daily validation of this worldview. How could a nation that produced such undrinkable swill possibly represent cultural achievement? Müller was particularly vocal in his criticism, and Kellerman had been observing him carefully for weeks. The German was 32 years old, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, before being captured during the Battle of the Bulge. His English was functional though heavily accented, and he possessed natural leadership qualities that made him influential among the other prisoners. Müller organized the morning coffee protests, turning individual complaints into group performances designed to embarrass the American guards and boost German morale. He would stand, hold his cup high, and deliver what Kellerman assumed were elaborate speeches about American inadequacy while other prisoners laughed and applauded. The morning ritual followed a predictable pattern. Prisoners would file through the serving line, receive their trays of powdered eggs, toast, and coffee, then find seats at the long tables. Müller would wait until most men were seated before beginning his performance. He would take an exaggerated sip, his face contorting in mock agony, then launch into his commentary. Other prisoners would join in, some pretending to gag, others making elaborate shows of adding excessive sugar in futile attempts to make the coffee palatable. The American guards, mostly older men or those with injuries preventing combat deployment, would watch with varying degrees of irritation, but rarely intervened. The prisoners were behaving, technically. They were drinking the coffee, or at least attempting to. The mockery, while clear, could not easily be classified as insubordination. Kellerman found the dynamic frustrating on multiple levels. He understood that maintaining discipline in POW camps required a delicate balance between firmness and allowing prisoners to maintain dignity. The Geneva Convention established clear rules about prisoner treatment, and the United States took those obligations seriously, much more seriously than the Germans had with Allied prisoners in their custody. American camps provided adequate food, medical care, and reasonably comfortable housing. Prisoners worked on farms and in factories, but under conditions far better than what awaited Allied prisoners in German camps. This moral high ground should have provided satisfaction, but instead, it felt like weakness when prisoners like Muller openly mocked their captors. The coffee situation was complicated by practical realities that the prisoners could not fully appreciate. The United States was feeding, clothing, and housing hundreds of thousands of German prisoners scattered across camps throughout the nation, while simultaneously supplying massive military forces on two oceans and supporting Allied nations with material aid through Lend-Lease. The logistics involved were staggering, requiring industrial production on scales never before attempted. Coffee in this context was a minor consideration. As long as it contained caffeine and met minimum caloric requirements, its palatability was irrelevant to or toward a masters managing supply chains that stretched across continents. The prisoners knew nothing of these complexities and would not have cared if they did. From their perspective, the bad coffee was simply another example of America. They had no concept of the industrial might required to transport millions of men across oceans, feed them adequately in combat zones, and simultaneously maintain prison camps for enemy soldiers. They saw only the immediate reality of terrible coffee and concluded that America lacked the sophistication to produce anything better. This fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities and priorities would make what came next all the more shocking. March arrived with unseasonable warmth that turned the Kansas prairie green weeks earlier than normal. Kellerman received orders that initially seemed routine but would prove anything but ordinary.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
A group of 30 prisoners, selected based on technical skills and cooperative behavior during imprisonment, would be transferred to Naval Station Great Lakes in Illinois for a special work detail. The Navy needed German speakers with engineering backgrounds to assist in documenting technical specifications of captured U-boats currently being studied at the facility. The assignment promised to last 3 months, offering prisoners a change of scenery and slightly better working conditions than the farm labor details most performed. Muller was among those selected, his background as a panzer mechanic making him potentially useful for understanding submarine mechanical systems despite the obvious differences between tanks and submarines. Kellerman would accompany the group as security officer responsible for ensuring prisoners remained under control during transport and at the naval facility. The assignment offered him his first opportunity to leave Kansas in nearly a year, and despite the continuing frustration of guard duty rather than combat service, he welcomed the change. The train journey from Kansas to Illinois took 2 days, with prisoners housed in a converted freight car under constant guard. Kellerman observed Muller during the trip, noting how the Germans' confidence seemed to grow with distance from Camp Concordia. He talked constantly with other prisoners, his voice carrying through the car with what Kellerman increasingly recognized as lectures rather than simple conversation. Muller was reinforcing group identity, reminding his fellow prisoners of their supposed superiority despite their circumstances. The coffee mockery came up repeatedly in these speeches, becoming a symbol of American inadequacy that Muller referenced whenever he wanted to boost morale among his men. Naval Station Great Lakes sprawled across 1,600 acres along Lake Michigan's western shore, a massive training facility that processed tens of thousands of recruits through boot camp while also serving as a center for technical training and research operations. The captured U-boats being studied there represented intelligence windfalls, their advanced technology providing insights into German submarine capabilities that Allied naval forces desperately needed. Bringing German prisoners to document these vessels' technical systems was controversial, but practical necessity outweighed security concerns. The prisoners could read German technical manuals and identify components that baffled American engineers unfamiliar with German design conventions. Kellerman and his charges arrived on a gray March afternoon with cold wind off the lake cutting through their uniforms. They were processed through base security, assigned quarters in a segregated barracks area, and briefed on work schedules and conduct expectations. The prisoners would work 8-hour days Monday through Saturday, documenting submarine systems under supervision of Navy engineers. They would eat in a separate mess facility away from regular Navy personnel to prevent fraternization. Guards would maintain constant supervision during work hours, and prisoners would be confined to barracks outside working times. The first morning at Great Lakes began with breakfast at 0600 hours in the designated prisoner mess facility. Kellerman led his group through the serving line, noting immediately that the food quality exceeded what they had received at Camp Concordia. The eggs were actual eggs rather than powdered substitute, the toast was fresh rather than day-old, and bacon strips added protein that had been rare in Kansas. The prisoners noticed this improvement as well, their expressions showing surprise and perhaps reluctant approval. Then they reached the coffee urns. Moeller filled his cup from the urn marked for prisoners, a separate container from the one serving Navy personnel. He took his habitual cautious sip, preparing to launch into his usual performance. His expression changed. The mockery died before it could begin, replaced by genuine surprise. He took another sip, longer this time, his face showing confusion rather than disgust. Other prisoners noticed his reaction and tried their own coffee, their responses mirroring Moeller's bewilderment. This coffee was different. Not good exactly, but significantly less terrible than what they had endured for months. It was drinkable without requiring heroic applications of sugar or cream. Kellerman watched this scene with interest, noting that the coffee served to prisoners came from standard Navy supply rather than Army procurement. The Navy, it seemed, maintained slightly higher standards for their daily rations, or at least used different suppliers with marginally better products. The improvement was sufficient to rob Moeller of his morning ritual. He could hardly mock coffee that was merely mediocre when he had spent months complaining about truly awful Army brew. His authority among the prisoners had been built partly on his willingness to voice their shared grievances, and now his primary complaint had been undermined by simple logistics. The work detail proved more interesting than Kellerman had anticipated. The U-boats housed at Great Lakes represented the latest German submarine technology, vessels that had been terrorizing Atlantic convoys until recent months, when improved Allied anti-submarine tactics and technology turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. The submarines were Type 9 and Type X boats, the latter representing revolutionary design incorporating snorkel systems allowing diesel engine operation while submerged, and streamlined hulls permitting unprecedented underwater speeds. American engineers were systematically disassembling these vessels, documenting every system and component to understand German advances in submarine warfare. Moeller and his fellow prisoners worked alongside Navy engineers, translating technical manuals and identifying components labeled only in German. Despite being prisoners performing labor under guard, they took evident pride in explaining the sophisticated technology their nation had developed. Moeller proved particularly knowledgeable about diesel engines and hydraulic systems, his Panzer experience translating reasonably well to submarine mechanical questions. Kellerman observed these sessions with mixed feelings. The prisoners were being useful certainly, but their obvious pride in German engineering felt like continued assertion of superiority despite their defeat and captivity. The daily routine at Great Lakes established itself quickly. Prisoners worked morning and afternoon shifts with an hour lunch break, returning to their barracks by 1700 hours for dinner and evening confinement. The food remained noticeably better than Camp Concordia standards, and the coffee, while nothing special, was consistently drinkable. Moeller's morning protests faded to occasional half-hearted complaints, his primary source of group entertainment eliminated by marginally adequate Navy coffee. Kellerman noticed the change affected group dynamics. Without the daily ritual of coffee mockery, Moeller's leadership became less visible and other prisoners seemed less cohesive as a unit. 3 weeks into the assignment, everything changed during an incident Kellerman would later recognize as the turning point of the entire experience. A water main break in the prisoner mess facility forced closure for emergency repairs, creating an immediate problem for feeding 30 German prisoners who could not be allowed to wander base facilities unsupervised. The solution, approved reluctantly by base command, was to feed the prisoners in the main enlisted mess during off-peak hours when regular Navy personnel would not be present. The prisoners would eat at 1300 hours between the regular lunch periods under heavy guard to prevent any interaction with American servicemen. Kellerman marched his charges into the cavernous enlisted mess hall at the designated time, so if you aren't enjoying it, preparing and narrating the story to this chart in normal meal periods. The serving line remained open with a skeleton crew of mess specialists preparing food for the irregular feeding time. The prisoners moved through the line receiving generous portions of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans and fresh bread. Then they reached the coffee urns. But these urns did not contain prisoner coffee. They contained what Navy sailors drank every day, brewed fresh every 4 hours according to specifications that bore no resemblance to Army standards. Moeller filled his cup with the caution born of months of terrible coffee experience. He raised it to his lips, took a sip, and his entire body language changed. His eyes widened. He took another sip, longer this time, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something approaching wonder. He looked at Kellerman, then at the coffee urn, then back at his cup as though suspecting some elaborate trick. Other prisoners were having identical reactions, their faces showing the same sequence of surprise and confusion. This coffee was not merely drinkable, it was actually good, better than good. It was excellent coffee by any reasonable standard, certainly far superior to anything they had tasted in months of American captivity. The silence in that vast mess hall was profound. 30 German prisoners stood frozen with coffee cups, their foundational belief in American inferiority suddenly challenged by a simple beverage. Kellerman watched Muller specifically, seeing the calculation behind the German's eyes as he processed this unexpected development. Muller took a third sip, this time clearly analyzing the coffee rather than simply drinking it. The richness, the lack of bitterness, the smooth finish that left no unpleasant aftertaste. This was coffee brewed with care from quality beans, prepared by people who understood that morale could be measured in small comforts like decent coffee. Muller finally spoke, his English faltering as he struggled to articulate his confusion. "This is what sailors drink, every day." Kellerman nodded, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what was happening. The prisoners had assumed that terrible army coffee represented America, but nations simply could not produce anything better. Now they confronted evidence that Americans could brew excellent coffee, they simply chose not to waste it on army personnel or prisoners. The implication was devastating to Muller's carefully constructed worldview. If Americans could produce coffee this good but serve terrible coffee to soldiers and prisoners, what did that suggest about American industrial capacity and resource allocation? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as prisoners found seats at the long tables and began eating their meals. But the coffee dominated their attention. Men who had spent months forcing down barely palatable army brew now savored every sip of genuine quality coffee. Conversations emerged in German, voices carrying across the empty mess hall as prisoners struggled to reconcile this unexpected experience with their assumptions about American hand-up abilities. Kellerman understood enough German to catch recurring phrases: industrial capacity, resource depth. We were told everything we believed. The coffee had become a crack in the foundation of German certainty. Muller remained silent through most of the meal, drinking his coffee slowly, while his expression cycled through emotions Kellerman could not fully read. Pride wounded, certainly. Confidence shaken, probably. But also something else, something that looked like the beginning of genuine understanding about the nature of the conflict they had lost. This was not just about coffee. It was about the revelation that American inferiority might have been propaganda rather than reality, that the crude, unsophisticated Americans they had been taught to despise possessed capabilities and resources that Germany could never match. After the meal, as Kellerman marched his charges back to their bed, he noticed Muller lagging slightly behind the group, his usual confident stride replaced by something more contemplative. The other prisoners walked in small groups, their conversations animated but subdued, lacking the usual edge of mockery that had characterized their interactions with America. The coffee experience had disrupted something fundamental in their group identity, introducing doubt where certainty had previously reigned. That evening, Kellerman filed his daily report noting the mess facility change and the prisoner reactions to Navy coffee. He wrote carefully, unsure how to articulate the psychological shift he had witnessed without sounding overly dramatic. Prisoners appeared surprised by quality of Navy coffee, seemed inadequate to describe men whose worldview had been challenged by a beverage. He settled for factual description and moved on, but the image of Muller's face remained vivid in his mind. That expression of dawning realization suggested something more significant than simple surprise at good coffee. The next morning, the prisoner mess facility remained closed, forcing another feeding at the main enlisted mess during off hours. This time the prisoners knew what to expect, yet their reactions to the coffee were even more pronounced. They filled their cups with something approaching reverence, drinking slowly and deliberately, as though trying to memorize the taste. Muller sat alone at one end of a table, his coffee cup held in both hands, staring at nothing while his breakfast grew cold. Kellerman approached cautiously, unsure whether to engage in conversation or maintain professional distance. Muller made the decision for him. Tu er proportionary pen prefer would the gener pro percentre tuneri Kellerman directly. That you were soft. That you had money but no discipline, no culture, no real strength. that you would collapse when faced with determined opposition. He took a sip of coffee, his expression pained. The coffee was proof, we thought. A nation that could not even brew decent coffee, how could such a nation defeat Germany? Kellerman said nothing, sensing that Müller needed to speak more than he needed response. The German continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But this coffee, what your sailors drink every day, this is better than what officers received in the Wehrmacht. Better than what we had in Berlin before the war. And you give this to ordinary sailors, thousands of them, every day. He finally looked at Kellerman, his eyes showing something the sergeant had never seen before in this proud German soldier. Fear. Not fear of harm or punishment, but fear born of understanding how badly he and his comrades had misjudged their enemy. How much else were we wrong about? Müller asked, not expecting an answer. The coffee is not important by itself, but what it means. If you can give this to ordinary sailors while fighting a war on two fronts, while feeding prisoners according to Geneva Convention, while building ships and planes and tanks in numbers we never imagined possible, then everything we were told was lies, all of it. The superiority we believed in, the certainty that German quality would overcome American quantity, it was all propaganda we wanted to believe because the alternative was too frightening. Kellerman found himself without adequate response. This moment of honesty from a prisoner who had spent months mocking inadequacy felt too important to interrupt with platitudes. Müller continued speaking, almost to himself now. I served in Poland, in France, in Russia. We won those campaigns so quickly, so easily. We were told it proved German supremacy, that no one could stand against us. But it was not supremacy. It was surprise and preparation against unprepared opponents. When we faced prepared opposition, when the Soviets organized their production, and the Americans joined with their industrial might, everything changed. We told ourselves it was temporary, that secret weapons would turn the tide, that American soldiers were cowards who would break under pressure. But it was lies. All lies, and we wanted to believe them because the truth meant we had already lost. The confession poured out of Müller in a rush, months of suppressed realization finally given voice. The coffee is what broke through. Such a small thing, so trivial. But I cannot deny what I taste. This is real, and if this is real, then everything else must be real too. The factories we heard about, the production numbers that seemed impossible, the endless supplies, all of it must be true. We lost not because we were inferior soldiers, but because we served a regime built on lies, fighting an enemy we had been taught to despise, but never truly understand. Kellerman finally spoke, his voice quiet. The coffee is just coffee, Müller. Good coffee, sure, but that is all it is. We are not trying to teach you lessons with beverages. The Navy has better coffee than the Army, because they have different suppliers and different traditions. That is all. But even as he spoke, Kellerman recognized the inadequacy of his words. The coffee was not just coffee, not anymore. It had become a symbol of something larger, a crack in the propaganda foundation that had sustained German morale through years of war. Müller nodded slowly, standing and picking up his tray. Yes, just coffee. But sometimes small things reveal large truths. Thank you for not laughing at us these past months when we mocked your army coffee. You knew it was terrible but said nothing. Discipline, I think, something we mistook for weakness. He walked away, leaving Kellerman alone at the table with thoughts he had no clear way to process. The remaining weeks of the work detail proceeded with noticeably different atmosphere. The prisoners continued their technical documentation work with the same competence, but the edge of superiority vanished from their interactions. Müller no longer delivered speeches about German achievement. The morning coffee ritual, when they occasionally ate in the enlisted mess during continued repairs to the prisoner facility, became quiet affairs with none of the previous mockery. Men drank good coffee in silence, each processing private reckonings with propaganda they had believed and reality they could no longer deny. Kellerman found himself viewing the prisoners differently as well. They were still the enemy, still men who had served a regime responsible for unimaginable atrocities and aggressive war that had cost millions of lives, but they were also men who had been lied to, who had believed those lies because humans generally believe what their society teaches them, and who were now confronting the gap between propaganda and reality in ways that clearly caused genuine psychological distress. The coffee had not made them allies or friends, but it had made them human in ways that propaganda on both sides tried to prevent. The U-boat documentation project concluded in late May 1945, days after Germany's unconditional surrender ended the war in Europe. The timing was grimly appropriate. The prisoners who had spent weeks documenting sophisticated German submarine technology learned of their nation's final defeat while in American custody, surrounded by evidence of the industrial and technological capabilities that had overwhelmed their homeland. For Muller and the others, the surrender confirmed what the coffee had begun teaching them. Germany had lost comprehensively, defeated not by inferior opponents but by enemies whose capabilities they had fatally underestimated. The group returned to Camp Concordia in early June on the same train that had brought them east, but the men who rode that freight car west bore little resemblance to the confident prisoners who had mocked Army coffee months earlier. They were quiet, reflective, responding to Kellerman's instructions without the previous subtle resistance. The war was over, their nation had been crushed, everything they had believed about German superiority lay in ruins alongside the cities Allied bombers had destroyed. The coffee seemed trivial now, yet Kellerman knew it had been anything but trivial in the moment. Back at Camp Concordia, the morning coffee ritual resumed with Army brew as terrible as ever, but no one mocked it anymore. The prisoners drank their coffee in silence, some perhaps remembering what Navy sailors drank daily, others simply too defeated to care about beverage quality. Muller sat at his usual table, but he no longer held court with speeches about German achievement. He drank his terrible coffee without complaint, his eyes distant, clearly thinking about matters far beyond Kansas prisoner camps. Kellerman watched him on these mornings, remembering that moment in the Great Lakes mess hall when good coffee had cracked the foundation of carefully maintained delusions. He wondered what Muller was thinking, whether the German understood that the coffee lesson extended beyond simple industrial capacity to something more fundamental about the nature of democratic societies versus authoritarian regimes. America could produce excellent coffee for sailors not because Americans were superior people, but because American society valued the welfare of ordinary citizens in ways that totalitarian systems never could. The coffee was not about coffee, it was about systems and values and the difference between nations that cared about small comforts for common people versus nations that demanded sacrifice for abstract ideals of racial and national glory. These thoughts remained with Kellerman through the summer of 1945 as Camp Concordia gradually emptied. Prisoners were processed for repatriation, though the devastated condition of Germany meant that return would be gradual and complicated. Muller left in August, part of a group bound for processing centers where they would await transport to a homeland most had not seen in years. Kellerman shook his hand at departure, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months earlier, but now seemed appropriate. They had shared something unusual, these enemies. Not friendship, but perhaps understanding. "Will you remember the coffee?" Kellerman asked, immediately feeling foolish for the question. Muller smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Kellerman had seen from him. "I will remember everything, Sergeant, the submarines, the work, the guards who treated us fairly despite having every reason to hate us. But yes, I will especially remember the coffee. It taught me that propaganda works in both directions, that my nation lied to me about enemies as much as it lied about everything else. That is an important lesson, though it came too late to change anything." They parted with mutual nods of respect, enemies who had discovered common humanity in the most unlikely circumstance. Kellerman never saw Muller again, never learned what became of the German after repatriation to a destroyed homeland. But he thought of him occasionally through the years that followed, wondered whether the coffee lesson had lasting impact, or whether post-war life had buried it beneath more immediate concerns of survival and rebuilding. The broader lesson of the coffee incident spread through informal channels among guards and administrators in the prisoner of war camp system. It became a story told to illustrate the psychological complexity of prisoner management, the unexpected ways that small details could impact morale and perception. Some dismissed it as trivial, arguing that coffee quality had no bearing on serious matters of war and captivity. Others recognized its significance, understanding that psychological warfare operated on multiple levels and that challenging enemy propaganda sometimes happened through accidental revelations rather than deliberate strategy. For Kellerman, the experience became a defining memory of his war service, more meaningful in some ways than the combat action he had missed due to injury. He had witnessed transformation, had seen men confronted with evidence that shattered carefully constructed worldviews. The coffee had been catalyst rather than cause, but its role was undeniable. In the vast machinery of industrial warfare where millions died and entire nations were destroyed, there remained space for small revelations that changed individual understanding in profound ways. The weeks following that first encounter with Navy coffee transformed dynamics at Naval Station Great Lakes in ways that extended far beyond simple beverage preferences. Kellerman observed changes in his prisoners with trained eyes developed through months of studying group behavior under captivity. Morning gatherings that had once been stages for Miller's performances became subdued affairs where men drank coffee quietly, lost in private thoughts about implications they were only beginning to grasp. The work detail continued with technical precision. German prisoners proved invaluable in documenting captured U-boats, their expertise allowing Navy engineers to understand systems that would have taken months to decipher without native speakers familiar with Wehrmacht technical terminology. But pride that had initially characterized their explanations gave way to something more complex. They still took satisfaction in explaining sophisticated technology, but now that satisfaction was tinged with sadness for a nation that had squandered engineering excellence in service of monstrous ideology and doomed strategic objectives. Muller proved most curious about American production capacity, his mechanical background giving him framework for understanding industrial questions. He asked Kellerman about tank production during rare conversations outside formal work contexts. How many Shermans had America produced? How long did manufacturing take? What percentage went to Allied nations through Lend-Lease? The questions reflected dawning comprehension of scale differential between American and German industrial capabilities. Kellerman provided answers when he could, explaining that American factories had produced tens of thousands of tanks, that production time had been reduced to hours through assembly line techniques, that significant percentages supplied Allied forces because American capacity exceeded a myriad. These numbers clearly shocked Muller, whose experience in panzer units had taught him that German tank production was measured in hundreds monthly at best, that manufacturing required days or weeks, that every tank produced was desperately needed with none spared for Allies. May brought news of Germany's unconditional surrender, transmitted through radio broadcasts that prisoners heard with expressions of relief mixed with despair. The war was over, they had survived. But their nation lay in ruins, occupied by Allied forces, its cities destroyed by strategic bombing and its population facing uncertain future under military government. The surrender confirmed what Coffee had begun teaching months earlier. Germany had lost comprehensively, defeated by enemies whose capabilities had been systematically underestimated by propaganda that prioritized ideology over reality. Muller spoke with Kellerman about concerns regarding return during one of their final conversations. He had no idea whether his family had survived, whether his Hamburg home still stood, whether he would find work in a destroyed nation occupied by foreign armies. The certainty he had carried through years of combat service, confidence that Germany would ultimately triumph, had been replaced by uncertainty about everything. The coffee revelation had been beginning of this transformation, small crack that widened to encompass every aspect of his worldview. June brought preparations for prisoner repatriation. Muller's group received departure orders in early August, part of larger convoy being assembled for transport through New York. Their final meeting happened by accident in the camp administrative building. They looked at each other for a moment, former enemies who had shared unusual experience that neither could quite articulate. Muller extended his hand, and Kellerman shook it. Muller spoke quietly. "Thank you for treating us fairly, Sergeant. The coffee lesson I will carry with me, reminder that believing comfortable lies is dangerous regardless of which nation tells them. I hope Germany learns this lesson before it is too late." They parted with mutual nods of respect, enemies who had discovered limited common ground despite everything that divided them. Kellerman never saw Muller again, never learned what became of him in post-war Germany. But he thought of him occasionally through decades that followed, wondered whether the coffee lesson had lasting impact or whether immediate challenges of survival had buried such philosophical concerns beneath more urgent practical needs. The story of German prisoners and Navy coffee spread through informal networks of veterans sharing experiences after the war. It became anecdote told to illustrate psychological complexity of prisoner management, unexpected ways that small details could impact morale and perception. Some listeners found it amusing, while others recognized deeper significance, understanding that challenging enemy propaganda sometimes happened through accidental revelations rather than deliberate strategy. The broader historical significance of American treatment of German prisoners became clearer with time. The United States had held more than 370,000 German prisoners in camps across the nation during the war, managing this population according to Geneva Convention standards despite enormous logistical challenges. This treatment contrasted sharply with German treatment of Allied prisoners, particularly Soviet prisoners who died in massive numbers from starvation and deliberate neglect. The contrast made impression on German prisoners who survived American captivity. Many later testified that their experience had influenced post-war attitudes toward democracy and they had experienced firsthand that democratic societies could be powerful without being cruel, that military strength did not require brutality toward defeated enemies. These lessons contributed to post-war Germany's eventual transformation into stable democracy. The coffee incident fit into this larger pattern of American prisoner treatment influencing German post-war attitudes. Prisoners who discovered that Americans could produce excellent coffee learned lessons about democratic resource management and societal values. They saw that American servicemen received better treatment than German soldiers had, that individual welfare mattered in ways that totalitarian systems never prioritized. The story ultimately transcends its specific historical context to illustrate timeless principles about human psychology, propaganda effectiveness, and power of direct experience to challenge ideological certainty. It demonstrates that maintaining truth and allowing that truth to speak for itself is more powerful than any propaganda campaign, because reality ultimately defeats lies when people have opportunity to experience that reality directly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.